macrobiology, and there's a pre-programmed rabbit trail in here that I want to talk with you guys about as well. So we talked last week about Pasteur's notion that spontaneous generation was impossible, and his coming at odds with a scientific community. You might call them the establishment, right? Just, how dare you suggest such a thing, right? He actually won the prize money with his the prize money that they offered to prove that spontaneous generation had happened, or that it was impossible, with his famous swan-necked flask experiment. Okay, and he convincingly demonstrated that spontaneous generation was impossible. So he did win the prize money, and this was in 1862. So you might have said, well, so evolution should have lasted 3 years then. Darwin published this book in 1859, and here we are. We already discovered that spontaneous generation is impossible. You can't get life from non-living things, so obviously you're screwed. You can't believe evolution anymore. That's not what happened, though. Okay, and this is evidence that people believe whatever they want to believe, and yeah, humans are weird that way. Pasteur was pretty proud of himself. He said, "Never will the doctrine of spontaneous generation recover from the mortal blow of this simple experiment. There is no known circumstance in which it can be confirmed that microscopic beings came into the world without germs, without parents similar to themselves." That was 150 years ago. People still clung to their religion. I mean, their what would you call it? A ridiculous idea that, oh yes, fleas can hatch out of grains of sand. Nonsense. What they did was they played the card that evolutionists are always playing, which is, well, we don't know that it didn't happen in the past, right? Just because you can prove that it's impossible right now, maybe on the early Earth, pond scum evolving into monkeys was possible. So, and yeah, keep in mind, most people have never seen a microscope. They've never seen pictures of this kind of stuff. And even those that had, they weren't looking at a whole lot of cellular complexity, okay? So when we look at cells today, we see a whole different world, all right? And this is about the level of complexity for a cell that you probably studied in biology, high school level biology. It gets way more complicated than that, so buckle up. We know so much about a living cell that it is impossible to represent that knowledge in one picture. In fact, we know that all of these structures up in here, okay, these guys, for example, these little dots, all these little dots represent what? Represent ribosomes. Okay, ribosomes are a macro protein. They're a humongous protein made up of tens of thousands of atoms, hundreds of amino acids, all arranged in specific orders. We can't, we drew it as a dot, okay? But there's a whole structure down there that we can't even see at this scale. All of these structures are made from proteins, except for the membranes, which are made out of fat. You do need fat in your diet, BT dubs, okay? And the DNA, which is, of course, deoxyribonucleic acid, okay? So if you're going to build a protein, you got to start with amino acids. Proteins are called macromolecules for two reasons, okay? First of all, you can see some proteins under a microscope. They're that big, okay? And second of all, they're made of smaller molecules we call amino acids, right? This is the structure for lysine, all right? And yes, we are quite lazy as organic chemists, and we just draw a little stick figure over here. And all the organic chemists in the room sort of look at that and go, oh, yeah, see, there's a carbon, a carbon, a carbon. And they know what we mean when we draw stuff like this, all right? And of course, you can get a little fancier with it, with your little Tinker Toy model there, and kind of show the electron clouds and things like that, and get a little more accurate in details. I do want to show you that amino acids are quite different from one another, okay? And yeah, you can't just go substituting amino acids for each other. It doesn't work that way. It's called a substitution mutation, and it's almost always fatal. All right. What it means is that the protein that you're trying to make doesn't work, right? So, for example, if you can't make hemoglobin, you're hosed. You can't transport oxygen to your cells, and you don't make it past zygote stage. Sorry. By the way, that's why a lot of, probably the entire reason why miscarriages happen, other than like drug abuse and stuff, right? Is there's some mutation that happens there, and sorry, that's part of the curse. And it sucks when that happens. Very common, by the way. So just know that, all right? And not all the humans understand this. A lot of people just think it only happens to them. It probably happens to everybody. Talking with my parents, I realized that they experienced it several times and didn't even know, because my mom is not so good at science. Okay. Anyway, so amino acids cannot be substituted for each other. You have to have the right one. If you don't, you will get the wrong structure. Okay. So you're going to have to build these things. Okay. They have to be arranged in a specific order if we're going to make, for example, ribonuclease. All right. Ribonuclease is the smallest known protein. Okay. It helps with the construction of new proteins. All right. It is made up of 17 amino acids arranged in a chain, 124 amino acids long. Keep in mind, that is the smallest one. Most proteins are hundreds of amino acids, and most proteins include all 20 of the amino acids that are available. Okay. So if you manage to build the thing properly and you put it into its structure and you fold it up properly in a Golgi body, you get a structure like this. Now, that is so complicated that it looks like chaos, right? You can't see the design in it anymore. But I promise you, if you go in there and you're like, let's see, and you switch a couple of those around, the whole thing doesn't work. It's designed to fit into a giant three-dimensional puzzle that is a living cell. And if it doesn't fit, it doesn't work. And basically, the cell can't do the things that it needs to do to keep it from turning into dirt, and it just turns into dirt. It dies. Okay. You have to have information to build these structures. Okay, this is maybe a better example of the difference between chaos and order. Okay.
Master builder.
Do what?
I'm a Lego master builder. I can see that and just put it together.
There you go. But it doesn't do it by itself, does it? You take that image on the left, you throw it into your washer machine, you put it on high. How many millions of years before you get a doghouse out of that?
You?
It never happens, right? We know that every time you open up the dryer after you've done a load of laundry, nothing is folded. Nothing. You cannot get order out of chaos. Your room never cleans itself. You wake up in the morning, you jump out of bed, the bed doesn't just like magically make itself, right? Everything tends towards chaos and disorder. This is against God's plan, by the way. And this is why we used to say cleanliness is next to godliness. We used to say that. And somebody was like, that's not in the Bible. And it's not, but it is a biblical principle that you are supposed to behave like your God who brought order out of chaos. There's this whole imagery in creation of God bringing the land up out of the water. And the Hebrews were freaking out when they heard that, because in their culture, water was chaos and the land was solid. So they just watched God bring order out of chaos, right? When God speaks, the waves just go bloop, and the storm is stilled. And they're like, wow, Jesus can bring order out of chaos. Maybe he's God, right? We sort of forget that. We forget why it's important to make your bed in the morning. Why does the military drill that into the recruits? Like, you have to make your bed and it has to be perfect, right? Why is that such a big deal to the military? Because the military is going to find itself in some chaotic situations every once in a while.
When they don't have a nice bed.
And they're not going to always have a nice bed. They're not, they're not going to be able always to fight the chaos and win. And neither will you. You will not always be able to fight the chaos and win. Sometimes you have a really sucky day and the chaos seems like it's won. And the people that, you thought you can count on, you couldn't count on the people that should be looking out for you are actually causing you all kinds of problems. It's very frustrating. Okay, which is why you have to practice all the time bringing order out of chaos, and you have to train up young people to do this. You might think this is really cruel, but when my kids were little bitty, as soon as they were able to get toys out of boxes, I trained them to put toys back into boxes. This was traumatic for them, okay? They hated it, right? At first. I would just be like, okay, you need to put away your toys. And they'd be like, my kids, they can't even talk, right? And I'd be like, I know, you know what I'm saying. Put those back in there. Here, I'll show you. And I would just like click on the beast mode and like clean up these blocks in like 0.5 seconds. See that? That's what you're going for. And they're like, wow. Right? And then I dumped them out. I'm like, okay, you do it. And they'd be like, okay, Dad. You know, and they do this thing where they play with all the toys as they're putting them out. Like, nope, dumped them out again. Go fast. And so they would go faster. Okay, that was better. That's not good enough. Go faster. See, the thing is, though, right now, the room is clean. I got 3 of them in one bedroom right now because we're doing some remodeling. The room is clean right now. They were trained from like day 1 to clean up after themselves. A lot of humans are not trained that way. I ran into a 15-year-old the other day who bragged that she did most of her own laundry. And I almost laughed at her. I was like, okay, not going to do that. At 15 years old, I was mending fences and hauling hay and basically ran a farm. So I did my own laundry when I was 5.
How old are your kids?
My kids are 3, 6, and 8.
With a clean room?
With a clean room.
It's good.
And it's always
Is
been
that a
clean.
complete
See,
preparation?
here's the thing. They don't come that way from the factory, okay? They are born agents of chaos, especially my youngest. That guy is going to be a Marine for sure. I mean, he will destroy anything. And it's just like,
Does he eat crowns?
no, that's a requirement though, isn't it? So anyway, so that is why it's important to practice that and to train your young people to bring order out of chaos, okay? Because the small humans, yeah, children, yeah.
Those things.
Because this is what we're trying to do. We are trying to impart information into the world, just like our Creator does, okay? So where does the information come from? It comes from the genetic codes. We got to take a little rabbit trail here and talk about Gregor Mendel, okay, who was a genius. Now, Mendel was a contemporary of Darwin, okay? Darwin was born in 1809. Mendel comes along not too much later in 1822. He's born not to a wealthy family like Darwin was, but he was born to poor farmers. Now, you might not realize this, but in the 1800s, basically 80% of the world's population was in abject poverty. Okay, you've heard of living paycheck to paycheck. Don't recommend that, by the way. You got to live beneath your means. You must have money left over at the end of the month. Okay, that is the only way to avoid financial ruin. Right? People who spend all the money that they have never have enough. All right. Anyway, and that might mean driving an old car or living in a small house, or skipping Chick-fil-A every once in a while. I ate bologna sandwiches for 6 months so I could save up enough money for my rifle. No regrets. My wife, when my wife figured out what I was doing, she was just like, okay, fine. Like, why do you always eat sandwiches? Like, okay, I got a goal here. I need an AR-15. Well, anyway, they're quite nice. Do what? Ramen? Yeah, I can't eat that stuff. It's disgusting.
It's
Oh.
so
It has
very
no
terrible.
nutritional, or it has horrible nutritional value.
It has lots of nutritional value.
So
Sounds
It's
good,
not the
though.
right nutritional value. Anyway, so Mendel is born poor, like almost everybody was back then. Okay, and he goes to school. Now, back in those days, in Austria, I think he lived in Austria, you could go to up to the 8th grade. And that was, and it wasn't great, it was just a book, okay? Forget about grades. Grades are an evolutionary, nonsensical, ridiculous notion, right? You're a homeschooler, you might even know what grade you're in. And I don't care what grade you're in. Some of your parents, not your parents, but in other co-ops, I've had parents be like, "Oh my gosh, so little Timmy is this age. Like, what class does he need to take?" Like, I don't care what age he is.
Physics.
Like, what is he taking? How did did he take physical science last year, or has he not taken physical science?
Little Timmy is 5.
Yeah, put him in physics. Hey, if he can handle it. I had a freshman take chemistry one time. His mom was all freaking out. Like, he had biology last year. I mean, he's really smart. Do you think he can really handle chemistry? And I was like, can he do algebra? He's really good at algebra. Okay, put him in there. And I told this guy, like, whatever you do, don't tell the seniors that you're a freshman. Okay. They had no idea he was. He had the highest grade in the class. Yeah, and he's just, that's what he was. He could do that. Anyway, so there were 8 books, okay? And when you went to school, your teacher would say, "Okay, what book did you just finish?" And you'd be like, "Well, I just finished the 3rd book." And your teacher would put you into the row of students that were in book 4. Here's book 4, okay? If you have problems or questions, ask the people behind you. They finished book 4 last year, okay? They're in book 5, okay? If you get done early, look around in front of you. Those guys are in book 3. You've already been through that. You might be able to help them. And that is how one teacher taught all the books, okay? They were basically just teaching how to read and write and do basic math and answering questions that stumped the other kids, okay? But from the first day of school, we didn't teach, but we trained humans. If you feel like you've got a good handle on this, teach it to somebody else. If you have problems, find somebody with more experience and ask them. We don't do that with kids anymore. Evolutionists got a hold of this and they were like, "Oh no, we can't have all of the grades in one building," because they had this really weird phrase called phylogeny recapitulates ontology, or ontology recapitulates phylogeny, or a bunch of nonsense. Anyway, they believed that humans like replicated their evolutionary stages as they grew. You should read up on it. It's hilarious. Anyway, that's not true, but they decided they were going to separate all the humans by how many trips they'd made around the sun and nothing else. And that you had to have teachers that were specialists, okay? Because we're trying to build an empire here. And if you're going to build an empire, you're going to need a lot of engineers and scientists to build your weapons so that you can control the whole world, okay? It kind of worked, but it destroyed the family in the process, and it did something even worse. It taught all of your peers in government schools that the only permanent people in their lives were people who were the same exact age as they were. Teachers are no longer permanent. There's no adult that's going to stay there. You get a new one every year. In fact, you might get a new one every hour and go to a different class. So it's very difficult for teachers to actually be disciple makers, because students don't care what teachers have to say, because after all, I only have to listen to you for a few minutes and then I'm out of here. Okay, it wasn't this lifelong relationship that is basically required for discipleship. All right, so this is a whole different world, okay? And if you think that this system was ineffective, I challenge you to go look up some 8th grade graduation tests and see if you could pass them. Because I'll tell you right now, I probably could not, okay? The level of knowledge that they were able to impart in 12 and 13-year-olds is nuts, okay? But the thing is, not everybody went through their entire school, okay? But okay, you worked at your own pace, so you could go as fast or as slow as you wanted to. But anyway, so that was as far as you got. Once you got to the 8th grade and you passed a test, which is the only way you could graduate the 8th grade, okay?
So you can have a 0 the entire year, but pass the test.
Yeah. Yeah, so people complain about homework and grading. There used to be one test at the end of the year.
Or colleges like then.
Colleges, same way, one test.
Like the
Fair enough.
but what?
And it used to be, and again, it didn't used to be that there were all these majors that you picked and you might have one professor that you liked and the rest of them are crazy. In colleges, similar to the way Jesus taught his disciples at that time, it was also true that if you wanted to be educated, you found a teacher, aka master, and you followed them around and paid their bills and just they taught you stuff. Okay, that's what discipleship originally was. Anyway, so Mendel lived at a time when this was all that was available to the common clay, right? The poor people. However, his teachers noticed that this guy was an absolute genius and basically told his parents, like, you have to get this guy a high school education.
High school education.
Now, here's the thing. Back in those days, high school was college prep, and that's all it was. Okay. You didn't go to high school unless you were going to college. All right. And how many people went to high school?
10%.
10 to 15% of the population, which is approximately the same number of humans in America who are doctors, lawyers, and engineers.
So those are the only people.
So the only people who went to college, and they're the only people who went to high school. So what are we doing here, guys? This is why Cartwright is famous for saying the only subject more important than science is history. What are we doing here? Trying to teach algebra 2 to everybody? Here's why. Here's why we're here. Okay. The reason being that the liberals, leftists, whatever you want to call them, they looked at this group of people and they started screaming and whining and crying and complaining because those guys made all the money. They were way wealthier than everybody else. And so they're like, oh my gosh, people with high school diplomas make so much more money than everybody else. And they lined up all the statistics. Statistics can lie to you, by the way.
Really?
My father-in-law is an auditor, and he tells me all the time there's lies, there's blankety lies, and then there's statistics, right? So they lined up all the statistics. Oh, if you have a high school diploma, you're making so much more money than everybody else. And why don't we just make high school education free, like 8th grade education?
Just lowered everything.
Well, that's not what they originally did. Originally, they did. They made all the high schools were like, wait, what? You're giving us money? Okay. And the government took over high school education, which used to be private. All right. And all of the same teachers, though, right? So they're teaching the same materials, and high school education is free. And the high school teachers started noticing that, not all these kids are all that good at math. Maybe they're fine at arithmetic, but algebra, geometry, trigonometry, calculus, these are challenging subjects,
College.
right? So they were like, well, this is, the kids that aren't doing well in high school tend to drop out and go get a job somewhere and start a family, right? And so this alarmed all of the bleeding heart liberals. Oh my gosh, why are these people dropping out? And so they made it mandatory. You had to go to high school. Well, the teachers got really sick and tired of trying to teach algebra 2 to people who knew they would never use it. And so they dumbed it down. And they started teaching stuff that you used to learn at the house, like cooking and home ec and welding and shop class. And let's make letter openers, guys. And everybody made a sword, right? And they were doing great. Okay, they had some kids that could learn the algebra 2, and who was it? It's 15, 20% that are called by God to go and be doctors and lawyers and designed to do that and have the IQ to handle it and the motivation. Not everybody with the horsepower wants to do that. Okay, seriously, one of the smartest, most intelligent students I've ever had works at a tire shop because he hates school. Great. Work your butt off. That's what he's doing right now. Didn't go to college. Anyway, so I want to emphasize that you guys know better than to listen to the government when it comes to what your educational standards are. Okay. And this whole idea that the average human needs algebra 2, needs, to learn a foreign language or Latin or logic or any of the other things that we really just require you to have by college, human anatomy and all this stuff. Like, yes, it's beneficial knowledge, sure, but it might be better for you to get a job and save your money. That might be way better for you. I'll give you an example. I took kind of a light load in high school and I worked my butt off. And when I graduated high school, I had $10,000 in the bank. I graduated in 2005. So 10 grand was an awful lot. That was a down payment on a house. Okay. I spent it all in college. That's the other thing about college. It's very expensive. Okay. College education, the cost of it has increased about 6 times what it used to be, adjusted for inflation. When my mom went to college, her tuition and her books were about the same price. When I went to college, my books were about 4 times what my mom's books were, which is, again, that's inflation. But my tuition was insane. Okay. A private school education these days will cost you somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000.
Unless you're super
It's
smart.
insane.
Even with scholarships.
Well, yeah,
Because of the
unless you're really, really smart.
Yeah.
Great.
Well,
Like 36.
I was really smart. I
Like
got a
36
32 on my ACT.
That's what my brother got.
Still not good enough for a full ride.
No. Depends where you go.
Yeah, that also has to do with it. Anyway, what I'm trying to tell you guys is college education ain't all it's cracked up to be. All right. If God has called you to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, one of those, a nurse, absolutely. Absolutely. But trying to say that we need a 4-year college degree to teach kindergarten?
Yeah,
What? Yeah.
yeah, I could teach them right out loud.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I don't think
I
Scout
can
has the
teach both
patience.
grades.
That used to be the test. Wasn't that originally the test, guys? If you've been through book 4, you knew what was in book 4 and that was the requirement. You had to be able to teach it. Guys, quit flirting up there. That was the standard. Can you teach it to somebody else? Okay. So anyway, so that's my little rant about, and I teach high school. Okay. So anyway,
How long?
Mendel, do what?
How long were you in college?
4 years.
15 years of-
Yeah. I graduated college in 2010 with a degree in biochemistry math. Anyway, so Mendel can't really afford high school and he buys books instead of bread and almost starves to death because he can't afford food. His younger sister, I should memorize her name, gives him her dowry, basically everything she had saved up so that, she can start a family and all of that. He ends up, because he's successful, he ends up supporting her family later on. So that's pretty cool. Anyway, so he graduates from high school and he attempts to become a teacher and he fails. He has a high school diploma, but he's qualified to be a teacher. He fails to become a teacher though. He joins a monastery, okay, which is well known for his scientific knowledge. He has a high school diploma. He goes to a college and tries to become a teacher because he was qualified to be a teacher because he had a high school diploma. I know. Anyway, because the high school diploma was that hardcore. Okay. One of the examiners, however, was very impressed and they got him enrolled in the University of Vienna. And he graduates from the University of Vienna, which is the greatest school in the world at the time. And he tries for the 3rd time to become a teacher and he fails. Okay. Let me plug this in. So why does he fail in his attempt to become a teacher? His teachers fail him because he has too much original thought.
Also something I've been told from
Yeah.
children.
Yeah. See, here's the thing. A lot of government schools,
A lot of old people will try to tell you what to think. Those people are dangerous, as far as I'm concerned. They're the opposite of what I'm trying to do. I am trying to teach you how to think, which is risky. And I know it's risky. I am very well aware of the risks. It's always possible, for example, that you could be smarter than me. You probably are. I'm okay with that. But you see, insecure people don't want to admit that you might be smarter than them or that you might know anything that they don't know. And so they build up this little wall where they never make mistakes and all this stuff, which is retarded. That keeps them from learning anything from you. And this is a division between the generations. I learn something from my students all the time. So I try to communicate with you in language that you understand, at least. Okay, hopefully I do a halfway decent job. Anyway, having original thought is beneficial, I would argue. Okay, and I would say, if I'm not tooting my own horn a little bit too much, it's one of the reasons why I've been successful as a teacher. Because not only do I have all this crazy ideas, but I encourage my students as well. Go for it. You got some brain power, use it. It's a muscle, needs exercise. And I want to also emphasize that this whole resistance of the establishment, and there's a certain way we do things around here, has always been with us as humans. And that there is some wisdom in that. Tradition has the potential to be helpful sometimes, but not always. And sometimes those fences are there for no good reason. We talked about some of these, like not wanting to have drums on stage in your church and things like that, that are just ridiculous. Okay, and this is the argument that the young people and folks like me have against rules that just don't make any. Why do you have this rule? Oh, well, we had this one problem. I used to work at a co-op, okay, not this one, a different co-op. And every time they had some kind of an incident or some kind of a problem, they added a page to the student handbook. More rules.
How did that go over?
Not so well, right? When I left that co-op, they had 66 pages in their student handbook. And I was like, do you guys not see how very similar to Pharisees you are? Because you're acting a lot like Pharisees. You're building a hedge around the law to try to make sure that nobody even sticks their toe over the edge. That's ridiculous. You're not dealing with the heart. Originally, there was one rule, guys. Speaking of originally, there was only one test. Originally, there was only one rule. In the Garden of Eden, there was one rule: follow God. So instead of saying, okay, this outfit, this is not really honoring God, is it? I don't think so. Yeah. Definitely should not be able to tell what color of underwear you're wearing. So here's a burlap sack where you can call your parents to, you know, instead of doing that, they had all these rules about what you could wear, you couldn't wear this, you couldn't wear that. Not very effective. One rule: follow God.
That's one thing I've never gotten about this school.
Well, I'm not picking on anybody.
We're not supposed to wear hats.
Racist, sexist. We're not supposed to wear hats. Yeah, you didn't know that.
No,
I didn't know that either.
you're not supposed to wear like this either.
Yeah, you're not
You're not
have a
supposed to wear
jacket.
open-toed shoes or have colored hair.
Well, Jesus wouldn't have. Wait a minute. Wait a minute.
My toes are dishonoring.
You're not supposed to have-
Now, I got a confession to make. My toes are probably dishonoring God right now, as they don't ever see the light of day very much. So I have these feet that are like 2 feet wide and 1 foot long, and it's like you don't want to see that. I got hairs on my toes. They're hobbit feet.
Same.
Ooh,
Hobbit-like. Anyway, so gotta be careful here, guys, because if you're not careful, you'll turn into one of these things. And you get so set in your ways, and you won't learn from the younger people, and you'll do all the same things, right? How do I know that? Because that's what not your parents, but their generation did. They were trying to be hip and all that, and they weren't. I mean, they were, but They didn't learn to communicate with people younger than them, and they didn't learn to communicate with people older than them either. I'll tell you right now, if I go to a roof inspection and I know the person is older, I will wear a flannel shirt, long pants, right? And just sort of, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, all this stuff, because that's how I talk about World War II a lot. I talk about the crazy music they got these days. I'm trying to communicate to the old people, and they love it. And they're just like, how old are you, young man? Oh my goodness. I got kids older than you. How did you get to where you could talk to us? I studied you, man. I figured it out. It's not that difficult. By the way, flannel shirts are awesome. Okay? There's a reason why they're legit.
They're great.
They're
Anyway.
fantastic.
So you got original thought, you got great ideas. You just got to be careful trying to communicate them to the old people, because you got to make it seem like it was their idea. It's called leading from behind. Okay? You're not always going to be successful, because some of these guys really are Pharisees, and that's what they do. And they're legalists, and that's the way they were trained. And they have some kind of a formative event in their life that caused them to be that way. And they're trying to protect themselves. And that is the most powerful motivation humans have, is fear. They're afraid that if they don't have all these rules, they'll just be chaos. It's not true, but anyway. So Mendel doesn't make it as a teacher. Okay, he has too much original thought, which is hilarious, right? I would say that would make an excellent teacher, but what was it, Plato or Socrates that got in trouble for the same thing? Corrupting the youth. Well, what was he doing? He was teaching them all this stuff about how to think, and they were like, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of stuff in our culture that doesn't make any sense. And all the old people got mad at him and killed him. I'm serious. And his students were like, what do we do? And he was like, you already know what to do. I already taught you. Go and keep doing that. And one of them ended up teaching Alexander the Great, who changed the world because he had a bunch of radical ideas about how to fight the Persians. And he won. Anyway, so just FYI. Okay, so Mendel, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Okay, Mendel started his work by establishing populations of peas that bred true. Now, I bet you that about year 3 or 4, the monks in the monastery were like, you know what, we should have just let him be a teacher. I'm so sick and tired of pea soup, right? Because he bred hundreds and hundreds of pea plants, okay? And he starts by having populations that breed true. So he gets this group of tall pea plants, and they always reproduce tall ones, okay? Hundreds of them. And he has another population over here, separated from these guys, that always reproduces short, vertically challenged pea plants. Okay, I'm trying to update my terminology. Okay, speaking of. All right, so he has all of these pea plants that always reproduce wrinkled peas, or always reproduce smooth, or they always reproduce green peas, or they always reproduce yellow peas, okay? So he starts by having you might call it a purebred population, and then he crosses them, all right? So he notices that all of the peas of the first generation have one characteristic from mom and dad. So he crosses the talls with the short, or the vertically challenged. He crosses the wrinkle with the smooth, the yellow with the green, terminal flowers versus axial flowers, and all of them have one characteristic, okay, from their parents. None of them are vertically challenged. They're all tall. None of them have wrinkled peas. They all have smooth peas. None of them have yellow. They all have green. And he's like, well, that's weird. One of the characteristics disappeared. And then he figured out, well, wait a minute, maybe it's still there, but it's hidden somehow. So he took those offspring that were all tall, and he allowed them to cross with each other, okay, and figured out that 75% of their offspring were still tall and 25% were short, vertically challenged. So,
Yeah,
what?
like me.
Like what? How does that? He figured it out. Can you figure it out based on that data? Because I can't. I'd be staring at that going, well, isn't that interesting?
Mendel figured out that there was a dominant and a recessive trait for every one of the traits he was looking at, and tall just happened to be dominant. So since he had a population that bred true, they had two genes. He didn't call them genes; he called them factors. There were two genes for tall, and they always passed on a tall gene. When you cross them with a short, you get one from the mom and one from the dad, and you always get one that is tall. So 100% of their offspring were tall. However, when you allowed the hybrids to cross, there's a 25% chance of you getting a short from mom and a short from dad.
Would that slowly change? Like, so you had the first line, and then slowly going down, it would slowly get smaller percentages, like.
Oh yeah, so you do get different percentages. Yeah.
It would slowly even in on it.
Right. So what happens is when you take the hybrid, right, and you cross it with a hybrid.
Oh, this is in terms I can't understand.
Is there some? What's it on the T's?
Okay, that is why 25% of the offspring were vertically challenged, right? Or whatever was the dominant, whatever was the recessive trait. You couldn't tell the difference between all of the tall plants. They all looked the same, but only 25% were purebred for tall. See,
It's pure
just by chance.
double big T.
So if you take this population, allow them to reproduce, these guys can only pass on a short. So here's the thing. So for example, if you had a hybrid that crossed with this guy, you end up with this ratio. And now 50% of the offspring have the recessive trait. And this is why inbreeding is such a problem, because if that is a mutation, the mutation propagates. Whereas if you cross with some other population that doesn't have that mutation, it disappears over time. So a healthy genetic diversity will maintain the genetic purity of the population. This is why America is so awesome, because we got people here from all over the world. And, you know, and again, this is why inbreeding is such a problem, because so many more mutations start showing up, and particularly developmental problems. So your IQ starts to suffer, your lifespan shortens, things like arthritis and blindness and deafness and all those kinds of things are way more common. Okay, and cancers and yeah, all that kind of stuff. Even though 80% of cancer is environmental, so it's what you're eating and what you're exposed to. Yeah, and the other thing about cancer is we all have cancer, right? Every single one of us has cancer cells in our body right now. It's just your immune system is so bad, it eats them. So anything you do that compromises your immune system, that's a no bueno situation, okay? Or increases the mutation of your cells. You have so many of them that it overwhelms your immune system, and all of a sudden, because you were exposed to asbestos, you develop mesothelioma.
Okay, so we already have cancer. It's just us getting our things that fight off cancers, those getting injured allows the cancer to grow.
Exactly. Kind of like if you have a garden with Bermuda in it and you weed it every day, the Bermuda will never take over.
Yeah.
Because it just, and the longer you leave it unattended, the worse it, and eventually the Bermuda just takes over and chokes everything else out.
But if you water down the stuff that you're spraying,
if you're constantly, if you have some kind of spray you're treating it with and you water that down, anything you're doing to allow that Bermuda to grow a little bit further before it gets taken out, it gets you closer and closer to it actually taking over some organ that you have that you need. You need your spleen, okay, and your kidneys and your liver, right? That's why the abuse of alcohol is a problem, and many other types of drugs. Alcohol is a drug, as is caffeine.
Poison.
And it's poisonous in a high enough concentration, like everything else. Do what?
I did not know alcohol was considered a drug.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, a lot of people say drugs and alcohol as if there's a difference.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
What makes alcohol a
A drug.
What
It is a narcotic.
Yeah. If you put alcohol in a pill and fill the bottle full of the pills, you'd have to have a prescription to get it. It would be considered a class 2 narcotic.
So just straight alcohol and pill?
Yeah.
What would that do?
Well, I guess,
Makes you sleepy.
Okay.
I mean, I guess there's alcohol in like cough syrup. and
Oh, yeah.
stuff, So.
Oh.
Which is
You
why
can't-
people,
you can't
that's
just-
why people say, oh my gosh, this cough syrup really knocks me out. It's 40% alcohol,
Don't taste like that.
right? And we think that's, you know, we
Tastes
just,
like some fake cherry.
we don't even, oh, that stuff's horrible. Okay, anyway, so Mendel figures out what's going on with the plants. Now, again, he was a contemporary of Darwin. You might have thought that, you know, news spreads like wildfire and Darwin figures out genetics. Nobody believes in evolution anymore. And you'd be wrong. Because Mendel's work, when he published it, everyone was like, oh my goodness. Oh my, well, another study of plant hybridization. Well, what are we going to do with this? I guess we'll put it on the shelf. And they ignored it. Okay. And so it doesn't come to light until the 1920s and 30s, when some bookworm was rummaging around in the library and discovered it. And they were starting to freak out that, holy crap, this is how characteristics get passed from parents to offspring. This is it. This guy figured it out. Now, Mendel got himself distracted. Don't do this. Okay. Lots of Christians do this. And I think it really damages their impact. Okay. He spends the rest of his life fighting against government control and overtaxation of the school. Stands for religious freedom, which is great, but yeah, he doesn't push his model very far. And yeah, people in his university knew about it and they knew he had this idea, but it is not common knowledge. When when genetics comes out in the forefront in the 1900s, this is a crisis for evolution. All right, they figured out the only way to change the genetic code was by mutation. Now, I want to illustrate for you just how stubborn humans are. Okay, you already know, but here's a great example. So when genetics comes out and it gets published, and they figured out that Mendel 60 years before, 70 years before, had discovered this principle of dominant and recessive genes and all this stuff. There were scientists so committed to evolution that they were sure that Mendel was wrong. And this guy, several of them actually, a whole team of them went out and replicated Mendel's experiments. They got true breeding populations of peas, they crossed them, they did all this stuff, they carefully documented their work, and they got exactly the same results that Mendel did. And when they published their work, they were all like, well, but that doesn't mean Mendel was right. Yeah, well, there's a reason why we don't remember any of those scientists' names, because they deserve to be forgotten. Okay, well, eventually science got dragged kicking and screaming into the truth of genetics. Okay, and they were forced, instead of believing Darwinism, which is the use and disuse idea that you can, you know, stretch your neck out a little bit further and your kids will have longer necks, right? That was his idea. Instead of that, they believe in evolution by mutation, which is taught in every government school in America, that you mutate, your cells mutate, your DNA mutates, and that's what, you know, that's how birds evolved from reptiles. Okay, we call this neo-Darwinism, and it's hilarious. I want to give you an example here, and then we'll call it a day. We have tested this evolution by mutation nonsense. Okay, now this was they tested 600 generations of fruit flies. About 20 days, 17 days, something like that.
Not that one day that everybody like.
Some species of flies live less than one day.
Really?
Mayflies and stoneflies in particular. Some of them live 17 hours.
It's so large, or like.
Oh, as larvae.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the maggots of them are actually bigger. Anyway, so Michigan State University evolutionary biologist Richard Linsky, you may have heard of him before, and his colleagues searched for signs of evolution in bacteria. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself.
1980, the search for proof of evolution by mutation led researchers to painstakingly and purposefully mutate each core gene involved in fruit fly development. They worked on this for over 10 years. It was published in I think it was published in 1990, and the authors won the Nobel Prize in 95. They proved that the mutation of these genes merely resulted in dead or deformed fruit flies. They made fruit flies with extra hair. They made fruit flies with white eyes, fruit flies with red eyes, fruit flies with legs for antenna, flies that had wrinkled wings, flies that had curled wings, flies that had no wings, which I suppose would be a crawl, right? Yeah, that's not a fly anymore. They killed a lot of fruit flies. So the author, the lead scientist said, well, this is proof that fruit flies have reached the limit of their evolution. Well, they took it one step further and they started working in bacteria, and they tracked it for 20 years, 40,000 generations of bacteria, roughly equivalent to like the entire supposed evolution of humans. If you look at 40,000 generations of humans, okay, in the end, the species they started with was hobbled by all of these accumulated mutations, and the only changes that occurred were degenerative. In other words, they were harmful mutations. So, Alan Linton, an evolutionist, said, where's the experimental evidence? None exists in the literature claiming that one species has been shown to evolve into another. Bacteria, the simplest form of independent life, are ideal for this kind of study, with generation times of 20 to 30 minutes. In other words, you can have a new generation in 20 minutes. Okay, some bacteria really do reproduce that fast, all right? And achieve populations after 18 hours, so you can have a couple of million of them in less than a day, right? So sterilize all you want, bacteria will come back, right? Anyway, throughout 150 years of the science of bacteriology, yeah, going back to Pasteur, right? There is no evidence that one species of bacteria has changed into another, in spite of the fact that populations have exposed to potent chemical and physical mutagens, and that uniquely bacteria possess extra chromosomal transmissible plasmids. You might not have known this, but bacteria do boogie every once in a while, and they exchange genetic information with each other. Okay, so if there was a beneficial mutation, it could spread throughout the population. I know. You had no idea you were going to be talking about tricky bacteria sex today, but that's here we are. All right. Oh, since there is no evidence for species changes between the simplest forms of unicellular life, it is not surprising that there is no evidence for evolution from prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells, let alone throughout the whole array of higher multicellular organisms.
Bye.
And you thought evolution was going to be a challenge. Well, I guess back. We'll go over the structure of proteins next week. Stay tuned. I will see you then.